Hey, this is Jack Carr checking in, and I get a lot of questions from aspiring writers and authors asking about advice. So I'm going to do two videos. This one is some writing advice, some that was passed on to me that I'm going to pass on to you, and some that I've figured out along the way, and then another video on my writing process. So two separate videos. This one right here is writing advice. So I just scribbled these things down fairly quickly before I jumped on here. So they were the ones that were at top of mind. And at some point I'll probably write an article, do a blog, or do something a little more in depth. But for purposes of this video, these are the pieces of advice that really jumped top of mind when I thought about sitting down and recording this. So here we go. First one, it's not even writing advice. It's just life advice. And it comes from John Wooden right here. There's his little blue book. And he said, make each day your masterpiece. So I think about that when I sit down to write, or really when I wake up in the morning to do anything. But it seemed like a good way to start this off. Make each day your masterpiece. Awesome advice. If you haven't read this book, it's a great gift also for the holidays, for kids, especially in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, high school, really anybody. But if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And it's on my reading list. You can go to my website and hit the reading list section right there at officialjackcarr.com. And a lot of these books are featured in those recommended reading lists. So you can check that out there. You can also go to Jack Carr Book Club on Instagram and see some of these books there as well. So make each day your masterpiece. Another one, Stephen Pressfield, who has been on the podcast twice before, or 3 times, depending on when you're listening to this or watching this. And right here, Turning Pro. And I'm not sure if he says it exactly like this in here, but the general gist is be a professional, sit down, and write. So I really thought that advice was fantastic as I was starting down this path. And someone also asked him, I think it was on the Joe Rogan podcast, about writer's block. And he said, you've never heard of a dentist getting dentist block or a truck driver getting truck driver's block. You're a professional writer. You sit down and you write. That's what you do. So I thought that was a fantastic piece of advice. And if you haven't read Stephen Pressfield's series of books on creativity, I'd start off with The War of Art. And then there's Turning Pro, The Authentic Swing, a great series of books, really not just for writing, but any creative endeavor. So check it out. This one right here, Turning Pro, Stephen Pressfield. And this one from David Morrell right here, who of course created Rambo back in 1972 with First Blood. And he has a book called The Successful Novelist. And I don't know if he says it in here or not, but I've heard him say it many times before. And he says, be a first-rate version of yourself rather than a second-rate version of another author. So I thought that was really fantastic advice as well. And he really means don't worry about anybody else. Don't copy anybody else. Don't look at trends in publishing or what other authors are doing. Just sit down and write. Do that work and write. Don't worry about anybody else. So love that. Once again, be a first-rate version of yourself rather than a second-rate version of another author, by David Morrell, who of course wrote First Blood and also Brotherhood of the Rose. And you've heard me talk about that before. David Morrell has also been on the podcast twice before. We did a really in-depth podcast for the 50th anniversary of First Blood. So you can check that out. But The Successful Novelist right there. He has a lot of incredible advice also on his website. Just type in David Morrell, author, and it'll pop up. I think it's davidmorrell.net. But check that out. A lot of great writing advice on there as well. And then here's one from me. Never miss an opportunity to make somebody's day. And that kind of plays into this because years ago, I guess in 2012, 13 timeframe, sat down with a buddy of mine, Jared Shaw, in the SEAL teams. He was getting out and moving into the private sector. So we sat down, talked about it, and I made some introductions for him and followed up and wondered how he was doing and just offered my assistance, really. And then 5 years later, after my first novel came out, he reached out and wanted to give it to a friend of his. And that friend just happened to be Chris Pratt. And now we have the Amazon Prime video series starring Chris Pratt, who is the person I thought of playing the role as I was writing the book. And that's before Guardians of the Galaxy, before Avengers, before Jurassic World, really when he was Andy Dwyer on Parks and Rec and had a very small role as a SEAL in Zero Dark 30. So never miss an opportunity to make somebody's day. And when you're sitting down to write and you're putting that plot together and you're making your outline, if that's what you do, then complex, not complicated. And I got that from David DiGilio, who is the showrunner for The Terminal List, screenwriter. And a showrunner in television is the person who is the singular point of contact for everything. So kind of like a director in a feature film, well, in television, there's the showrunner. So in this case, that is David DiGilio. He wrote the first episode, ran the writer's room, incredible guy, but he passed that along to me. Complex, not complicated. And so I've been thinking about that as I've been writing ever since he told me. So, David DiGilio, thank you so much. And you can't please everyone, and that's okay. And that's from Salman Rushdie, who, of course, sending thoughts and prayers to him as he recovers from his stab wounds. But that's what he said. You can't please everyone, and that's okay. So for those of us who look at reviews or look at comments on social, and if you engage on social channels and you want to say thank you to people on social channels, well, you're also going to see those negative comments and those negative reviews as well. And just got to let them go. So you can't please everybody, and that's okay. Salman Rushdie. And I got this Patrick Bet David. So I was doing this anyway, and he just put it so succinctly that I loved it, so I wrote it down. And he said, outwork, out-improve, out-strategize, and outlast. And I love those 4 things when you're sitting down to work. So got that from him, thought that was very poignant and insightful. And then last one is another one from me, and that is never pay attention to the odds. And I say that because people are going to tell you, if you tell them that you want to be an author or that you're a writer and you aspire to be published, that you'll get looks. And even if they don't say it, those looks will kind of be like, you'll grow out of it when you understand how difficult that is. Like life's going to beat you down, and it will. You just have to keep getting up and moving forward. But don't pay attention to those odds, because if you do, you're wasting bandwidth, and that bandwidth needs to be focused on the product, in this case, on a book. So all of that bandwidth has to be focused on making it the best book that it can possibly be. And if you're worried about those odds or worried about getting published or making the bestsellers list or whatever it is, then that's a part of your bandwidth that's not focused on making that product, that book, the best that it can possibly be. So never pay attention to the odds. All right. Also, read in your genre, and not just the stuff that's coming out around this time or the time. If you decide, I think I want to try this, and then start reading just modern authors in your genre. No, I mean, know and have read those authors who essentially created the history of your genre. So that is so important to know where things came from and who those masters were that built the foundation that you're building on today. So for me in the thriller genre, Richard Connell, and if you've read my books, you know that I've talked about him in the acknowledgments quite a bit, but Most Dangerous Game, he wrote that back in 1924. We can go to 1939, Rogue Male with Jeffrey Household, go to 1972 with David Morrell, First Blood, Last of the Breed, Louis L'Amour in the mid-'80s. So there are these certain books that move the genre forward, and that's always my goal, is to move the genre forward, even if it's just by a degree, because that's what those guys did. And they built this incredible foundation and wrote these amazing books that I loved to read growing up, that inspired me to both join the military and then write thrillers afterward. So know the history of your particular genre and have read those books that created that history of your genre. Write it for yourself. Write it for your bedside table. If you're sitting down to write, don't waste time thinking about what's selling right now, what's hot right now. Don't chase any trends in the genre. And of course, you can if you want. This is just my advice. But write it for your bedside table, and don't think about who's going to read it or if it's going to resonate with this person or that person or people that like these kind of books or that kind of books. Just write it. Write the best book you possibly can and write it for your bedside table. Don't worry about agents. Don't worry about publishing houses. Don't worry about websites. Don't worry about social media presence. I had none of those things when I started writing. So I wasn't worried about them at all. Everything was focused on making the book the best that it could possibly be. So write it for your bedside table. And don't study how to do something for too long. You can essentially read how-to books for the rest of your life. And everybody's going to have a different number of books or a different amount of time that they're going to invest in how to do something. For some people, it might not be any books. For some, it'll be one book. For others, it'll be two. For others, it'll be 10, whatever it is, but don't spend forever studying how to do something. Eventually, you have to put those books down and execute and write your own. So don't study how to do something for too long. What I did find helpful and have found helpful my whole life, though, is reading books, autobiographies by authors, and then biographies about authors. So this one right here, Louis L'Amour, Education of a Wandering Man, right here. The Life of Ian Fleming right here, John Pearson, and this one here by Jean Le Carré right here, The Pigeon Tunnel, Stories from My Life. So this is obviously by Jean Le Carré. And Frederick Forsyth, The Outsider, My Life in Intrigue. Once again, it's by him, so this is an autobiography, but I love when authors write books about their life. There's also, even if there's just one little nugget in there, there'll be something. And then Jean Le Carré right here, so this is the biography, Adam Sisman, incredible book right here, but once again, it's inspiring, and you learn so much about the author's process by reading about them, both books about them and their own books. And then this one for me here, Joseph Campbell, yep, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I have a couple different editions of this one, but was introduced to him back in 1986, 1987, 1988, somewhere in there, where he did a series of interviews with Bill Moyers, 1988, I believe. It was called The Power of Myth, and I found Hero with a Thousand Faces through that series of interviews that he did with Bill Moyers on PBS. So it's a great one right there. And I couldn't find it. I was running around last second trying to grab these books, but On Writing by Stephen King is another great one to read that I would recommend anybody read that is starting down this path. And another one, and Brad Thor passed this along to me, and I think I found someone else who said it in the 70s, who then passed it to Brad, who then passed it to me, but I'll pass it along as well because I think it's so fantastic. And he said, the only difference between a published author and an unpublished author is that the published author never quit. And that really spoke to me, especially because of my history in the SEAL teams and in BUDS, SEAL training, where not quitting is a big part of it, because about 80% of people are going to quit, and 20% are gonna make it. So you want to be in that 20% that makes it. But yeah, I love that one. The only difference between a published author and an unpublished author is that the published author never quit. Also, there's a difference between nonfiction and fiction. So nonfiction, you can sell an idea to an agent and a publisher. You can sell an outline. You can sell a first chapter, that sort of a thing. But for fiction, you have to have the whole thing done. You have to have a complete manuscript done. And everybody's going to get to a different point where they think that it's ready to show an agent, to show a publisher. And for me, I knew that I could spend the next 40, 50 years making my first novel a little bit better, but it would get better by a degree or two or three. So once you get your book, once you get your manuscript to that point where if you spend the next 50 years on it, that it's going to get better, but only by a little bit, then that's the time to switch those gears and figure out how to get it to an agent. Going to places like Thriller Fest, where you can sit down with an agent. I think BoucherCon, which is a convention, authors convention, does that as well. But they have a author speed dating where you, or agent speed dating, where you sit down with an agent for like 2 minutes and you give them your pitch, and then you get up and go to the next one. So you hit like 20, 30, 40, 50 agents in a day. And I know of a few different people who that's worked for. So highly recommend going to Thriller Fest, going to BoucherCon, and doing that when you have your manuscript, when you have your book, the best that you can possibly make it. And then finally, you're going to have to sit down and do the work, just like anything else in life, doing the work. And of course, make it the best you possibly can. So those are some initial thoughts on writing advice, because I do get a lot of those questions on social channels. And instead of writing all that out to every individual person that asks the question, then I'm going to point them in the direction of this video. So I'll probably do some more as I think through it a little deeper over the next few years. But off the top of my head, those pieces of advice that were passed to me, those things that I've learned, I think are the most valuable because they came to the forefront when I sat down to do this. So good luck out there and make it happen. Get after it.